My name is Anja Aronowski-Kronberg, and I'm here both as the editor of this project, which is called Vestoy, which is, comes in an annual book form. This most recent one is themed on transparency. We've done other themes in the past have included shame, failure, masculinities, power. So you get the general sense. The idea really is to bridge theory and practice in fashion. So that means the academic world, or the world of fashion theory and fashion studies, but also keeping a firm foothold in the industry. So you'll always find interviews with industry professionals. In the most recent issue, for instance, you'll see Miuccia Prada speaking, Demna Vasalia, Virgil Abloh. So, and then those people are asked to reflect on whatever the theme happens to be. You also find fiction, visuals. The idea is to have a kind of more, let's say, I don't know, intelligent, if I can be cheeky, take on fashion. So that's me. I'll obviously be the moderator. You'll see that from the position. And now I'd like to ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, because I think they will do a better job of it. So I'd like to start with Simonetta, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Anja. So, and you know, it's difficult in my age to shrink in 3 minutes, you know, the explanation of who I am. Anyway, I will try. I am a consumer psychologist. Let's start with the academia background. I started to teach to designers in Domus Academy for many years. Domus Academy was the first postgraduate school in design in Milano. Then I moved to Sweden, where since 2004, I think, I've been teaching and running an initiative that we named the Design of Prosperity, in which we are really kind of understanding beyond the common sense of what we understand as design as the fantastic tool for giving a good shape, functional shape to the things of our world, but what design means in terms of creating new projects of what we understand being a desirable future. So exploding, so to say, the meaning of design beyond its typical limits. But on parallel, I have always been also a consultant, and I have been working with at CEOs and executive level with a very broad spectrum of the so-called consumer good industry. So with 3 main focuses. The one that I think for people are the most important dimension for defining their own identities and their own understanding of what is a good life. And this is food and fashion and, of course, design. Design, because we also understand our home as our third skin. No? So this is more or less about me.
Thank you. I'm Cecilia Tall from the Swedish Textile and Clothing Association. My background is I have a Master of Science in Polymer Science, so I'm a bit different from at least some of you. And I joined the association a few years ago. But it's not that bad a background, actually, since we work a lot with sustainability issues. We work a lot with digitalization, the future of innovative textile and the textile industry. In Sweden, we have been working for years together with the communities around Borås, where most of the production is done, to save water, save energy, to switch to better chemicals and so on. So that's mainly a work that has been going on for years at home, but then we have the production abroad as well, and we try to take the experiences we have from home and also to adopt that when we're not in Sweden.
Thank you. Yeah, and my name is August BARD BRINGEUS, and I'm one of the 2 co-founders of Swedish menswear startup called ASKET. We are an online-only direct-to-consumer brand, so a digital native vertical brand, if you will. Started in 2015, and we started out of the consumer vantage point, the frustration that it is so hard to find garments, the garments that we actually need and love and use the most, which are, you know, the wardrobe essentials, from the white t-shirt to the blue Oxford to the crew neck merino sweater, without compromise, that there's always something, the fit, the quality, the price, the origin of the garment. You always need to compromise, and so we started out with the mission to free these items, which are, you know, the things you actually need, from the whole fashion economics, the whole fashion dynamics, and focus on building a single permanent collection, one garment at a time. And meanwhile, after 3 years now, we have assumed the mission to, in an extension of this, slow down the pace at which we consume clothing and consume overall by restoring meaningfulness, educating the consumer on where garments come from, what it actually takes to make them, and provide an attainable and sustainable alternative to high fashion and fast fashion on the other spectrum.
Hello, I'm Emilie. I'm currently teaching at Institut Français de la Mode in Paris. I was trained as a designer, and I have experience and still am working in the luxury industry and fashion industry in Paris. And about 5 years ago, I was a bit frustrated with only being in the practical aspect of fashion, and so this is when I went back to school and began a PhD. And so for the past few years, I've been teaching fashion history and theory to students of IFM in Paris, but also Parsons in Paris. So my point of view is both historical, academic, and quite practical.
Hi everyone, my name's Holly Syret, and I am working at the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. My role is that of Transparency Manager for the HIG Index. So the SAC is a business association, a collaboration basically between brands and retailers and manufacturers, but also a cross-section of the industry, also academics, NGOs, civil society. We represent organisations with a turnover over 500 billion. I don't know if that says anything to you. I'm not officially allowed to use the term a third of the industry, but I think that's more or less it. The coalition started from a really unlikely match between a brand called Patagonia. It's an outdoor brand that's quite pioneering in sustainability, and Walmart, the mega US wholesaler. And they came together with this vision of a transformed textiles industry and fashion industry, where people would have, or people in the chain would have, a positive impact, and it positively attribute to their communities, and also reduce the environmental impact as well. Sorry, it's a bit of a long introduction. And so through the coalition, a tool was created, and that tool's called the HIG Index. And it's a tool to really enable brands and manufacturers and all these different organizations in the textiles industry to measure their sustainability journey wherever they are. My role is that of Transparency Manager, so I'm working with these large brands and small brands and manufacturers to support them in disclosing information with as one of our end goals, but to empower consumers to make an informed purchasing decision.
Thank you so much to everyone. So I thought we'd start really basic, because the theme for our conversation focuses on trust and transparency. But since we are here from many nations, I'd like to start just by defining, or maybe we try together really to define what these terms mean, and where we want the focus to lie for our trust and transparency conversation now. So Simonetta, maybe we start with you. How would you define trust from a consumer standpoint? What makes a consumer trust a brand, say?
Trust is something that you start to talk about when you don't have it anymore. And trust is, the reality is that actually the things that have been happening in the consumer goods industry as such have been breaking in a way that self-granted attitude that we had as children have towards their parents, that what we were consuming was safe, was clean, was just, was something that would have not been harmful for anybody. And that was broken. That got broken first probably in the food business, in the food industry, but then lately also with what happened in Bangladesh became also something that touched the fashion, apparel industry. NGOs have been doing a fantastic work, I think, in the last 10 years in also disclosing things that were not evident about the simple gesture that we thought it was so harmless, you know, of just buying something that is nice, that we want to wear for having a nice feeling about ourselves, and disclosing the fact that our industry is the second dirtiest industry of the planet. So, of course, this is not as much mainstream-wise touched the level of awareness of other industry, like, for instance, the food industry, but is growing. And this very moment of truth, of understanding that every single gesture in our life has repercussion on our planet and on other people, is something that has been putting our issue about trust in pole position. I don't want to mention about the fact that in terms of trust, there are other things that have happened and are happening that are also very troublesome. The trust regarding our policymakers, medias, and businesses is at its all-time low. And there are studies that have been made recently that give the evidence about that. So it's an overarching issue, and we name it, we verbalize it, and we are worrying about it because we talk about things that don't exist. When you are in love, I always say, you don't talk about love, you make love. When you are young and healthy, you don't talk about sickness, an unhealthy situation. You start talking about that when you start to be old and sick. So we are talking about trust. We are talking about transparency, because today there is a lot of absence and lack of it. Okay.
So, since you, Simonetta, you're talking a lot about, you have now been talking about the moment we are in now. But Emilie, from your perspective, since you're our resident historian this afternoon, your research is focusing on the 19th century French fashion industry. So, could you add something about what the relationship between buyer and seller would have been, and if there is anything in particular that you can see that has created this downwards spiral leading to where we are today?
So it's striking, because what you're describing is what I was reading when I was working on my PhD this weekend, and I was reading about French men and women in the 1820s, so that's 2 centuries ago, saying, how can we possibly buy a hat that only costs 6 francs? Think of all the poor women and poor children who are working to make this hat or this corset or something. So what I'm really digging into right now, what I'm reading to advance my research is really this. What we're denouncing today is something that's 2 centuries old. So what I'm interested in is, because it was quite discussed. People were outraged. They were saying, what are we doing to the workers? We have to realize that when we're buying a jacket is a material object, but it's also labor, and people were very much aware of this and very shocked about this. And if you think of Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx going throughout England in the mid-19th century and looking at cotton mills and also being outraged at what was happening for the working class here, these are things that we were observing in our countries at the time. And what I'm sort of wondering now, because I'm sort of focused and obsessed about my 19th century, but it's good to sort of move away from this and realize that we're asking ourselves the same questions. Have we forgotten in the meantime that when you buy a jacket for 5 francs, what's the meaning of this? What's the consequence of this? So maybe what's interesting to understand, it's what was the process of sort of erasing this sort of consciousness of between the consumer and the product? What happened in between? It's an open question.
Is it an open question that anybody else on our panel would like to attempt? August?
I can give it a shot.
Yeah, please.
Well, I'm not fully as versed in fashion history or textiles or manufacturing history as you are probably, but I mean, with the rise of certain concepts such as fast fashion and in a globalized economy, where price and speed have been the primary decision factors for companies, we have started to, of course, offshore this type of manufacturing, and you've seen, you know, a dip in European manufacturing, and literally the further away that travels, the less we think about it, the more we forget what it actually takes to create a garment. And, you know, there's been, I don't know, I think IKEA and H&M fight about who coined the term democratizing design, but really they shouldn't be fighting about it. They should try to, you know, hide that, because they're not democratizing it. They're democratizing it for, you know, the consumer, perhaps, that it is more attainable, but they have also contributed to, you know, an extreme forgetfulness in what it actually takes to create clothing, because you no longer look beyond the surface. People are probably, if you ask them now, the average consumer probably thinks that, you know, t-shirts come off conveyor belts somewhere. Has become forgotten that it is handcraft, and thus we have stopped to consider the consequences of buying a t-shirt at the price of a Big Mac. Not that that is good either, but yeah.
Okay, so just stepping back a little bit, like listening to what has been said so far, it made me think, I wonder if you can, how linked are actually trust and transparency? Like, do you think it's possible to have trust without transparency? Or are these two terms, do they always come as a pack? What do you think, Holly? I mean, from where you stand, your vantage point from working with big companies, but also being about to create a tool that consumers can use as well.
Yeah. So the question was, can we have trust without transparency, and vice versa? I mean, I think transparency has a large role in increasing trust and securing people in the decisions that they make. And I think from the experience that we have working with, for example, brands and manufacturers, and testing like how to communicate in a transparent way, a lot of the things that we got back were, we want to be able to trust our brand. We want to be able to know that everything on the back end is okay, is sorted out. So on both environmental and social aspects. But we don't want to do too much work ourselves. We want to know, we want to have access to the information, or know that we can find out some way, okay, this brand has got their stuff sorted out, but they don't want to have to be responsible to do that over and over again. So they're looking for certain trust, and they're trying to find that through transparency.
So we, in the conversations we had before we officially started the panel, Emilie, you were mentioning, it was quite interesting just how often French companies in particular right now focus on craftsmanship, heritage, skill as a part of a brand's communication, let's say. It's curious, really. I mean, because those, I mean, just by virtue of seeing an image with a craftsman, you know, hand stitching an Hermes bag, for example, it's as if it's meant to inspire feelings of trust, at least, if not transparency, because in fact it's anything but transparent. Tell us a little bit more about you were mentioning a campaign that was banned in England recently.
Right. So it was almost maybe 8 years ago, maybe some of you remember it more precisely. It was a set of Louis Vuitton campaigns picturing artisans. It really looked like this 17th century Dutch painting where there was a black background and you had a very inspired shoemaker putting the finishing touch on a shoe, another lady working on a handbag, and it was beautifully lit. And it was really about celebrating the sort of very iconic image that we all have of the craftsman, something it's people fantasize over, that's extremely romanticized. So quite intelligently, Vuitton was saying, well, that's what we're selling to people. We want them to understand that our products are made through this century-old tradition of craftsmanship. But I don't exactly know the name of the institution, but in England, they were banned from magazines and probably online campaigns as well, because they were understood as making up something that doesn't actually happen. That today the manufacturing process behind a shoe or a bag, even if it's a luxury shoe or luxury bag, it doesn't happen in a small workshop with only candlelight. It's a very industrial process. Doesn't mean that's not as good quality. It's just a totally different context. It's something very different, and it's something that I often show my students when we discuss these issues, fashion, craft, and how fashion is very eager to use this whole rhetoric of craftsmanship today. How it's something that inspires people, and this is the dream we're selling right now. So yeah.
So if we're talking about that, that rhetoric being applied certainly to France, I guess Italy, the same European countries that have this, or have had at least this grand tradition of craftsmanship. I mean, in Sweden, we haven't had that in the same way. But I'm wondering, when it comes to TEKO's members, Cecilia, what do you find is the area that they typically ask for the most help when it comes to these issues of trust and transparency?
Thanks. Well, I mean, it differs from the companies who have the production in Sweden. Then it's a lot easier to have transparency all through the chain, because then you go down to the factory floor actually and look at the people doing it, and you know, at least that parts of the chain are being fair from that perspective. The other companies, and it's a bit of a difference between small companies and big companies, I would say. The SMEs have difficulties with the very, very difficult supply chains that we have in
SMEs?
SMEs, okay. Small, medium-sized enterprises.
Thank you.
Yeah. These smaller companies, but not necessarily small, like 10 or 15 people. It's a few hundred people in the larger SMEs. But they also have difficulties in actually, when they ask, getting the right answers or getting answers. Because when you work far, far, far from Sweden, it's cultural differences as well, and they maybe tell you what they want because they want to do your goods. So it is a difficult situation, and they want to do their best, but it's not always that easy getting the information if you're not a multinational company, I would say. So
how do the SMEs that you engage with, what kind of practices, I mean, what sort of questions do they have to ask, or what do they need to do to get the information?
Well, I mean, they can engage in like the Higg Index, and Holly has a lot more knowledge about that than I am, but at least they should start thinking that this is something we need to be transparent to our customers and to be transparent to the future customer. Because, I mean, we are not Today, we're so far from production in Sweden that many people, at least my age and younger, we don't know how to make our own clothes. Small kids think that it's sort of produced, not sewn. It's like spaghetti that grows from the ground. So they don't know what actually to ask. Yeah. So that's a difficult situation right now. But of course, the industry has a lot more knowledge than that. But the consumer doesn't know what to ask for.
So with that in mind, I just want to bring, kind of loop you, August, in again, because ASKET is a company that makes a point of saying, you know, this is from your 100 euros spent on a jumper, and X amount of euros goes on buttons, X amount of euros on, you know, transport and so on. But something I thought was quite curious when I was looking into ASKET was that, and I've noticed this with the few other companies that are around that do promote this type of transparency, that seems to be a lot of transparency focused on the production side, but then the design, creative, marketing side, I mean, on your website, for instance, you haven't itemized that in the same way. How come?
The practical answer is that it is when you set up unit economics, meaning, you know, what are the individual costs to produce a garment, it is easier to look at, of course, the material required, the consumption of, you know, meters of fabric, buttons, what does this cost? Whereas, you know, design, overhead, marketing, etc., most times would be considered it's overhead. So, you know, you spread out that cost over everything you do. So it's not as easy to attribute that type of cost to the creative work or the value of the creative work, I would say. And in our case, it's simply because, you know, we do this to highlight what it takes to create this garment, and I think people have an easier time picturing a designer or, you know, an office worker, white collar in Stockholm, than picturing a worker in a factory, a seamstress, a picker on a farm in Egypt, than, you know, us hiding behind our computer desk. So to us, it's much more important to educate and highlight on what happens in the manufacturing end than what happens in the you know, design, marketing, and selling end. If you want those costs, you know, the books are public in Sweden anyway, so you can always find those. But I also wanted to get back to something you said, that you know, the challenges with small, medium-sized enterprises. To me, I honestly don't think it's an excuse. I think it's about, you know, you need to set your priorities right. For us, we recently launched a new standard in traceability in April. We managed to trace our Oxford shirt back to the cotton farm in California. And when we achieved that, we said, okay, we're going to do this with everything now. And so basically we've switched the way we source. Now we don't say we're going to do this style, this garment, and then we go from a garment to a material and material to supplier. We start by screening suppliers who can actually provide full transparency, who will actually allow us to come with a camera team to the farm. And what are the requirements? And then all of a sudden, yes, the amount of those suppliers is much more limited. But if you ask the right questions from the start, we need to actually change the way we produce. We need to flip it around, find a good material first, a good quality, and then a good way and a good place to sew it. And then we can see, what products and what do we need and can we make.
Simonetta, do you still want the mic? Here you go.
Yeah. No, I would like to raise an issue that is, burning in my heart and mind at the moment, which is the fact that transparency has already become, a buzzword. It got very inflationated in the last times, and what was for all of us understood as a vehicle for reconstructing and rebuilding our trust and our trustworthiness is in a bit risk of becoming instead the opposite of it, because transparency has many layers. When we say transparency, which is a beautiful word, it's an analogy, it's a fantastic metaphor. We evocate and associate to so beautiful things like a crystal clear blue sky, that when we open the window, we just see this beautiful scenario of clarity in front of us. Yes, but transparency is also something else. It has also a depth. It allows us to see not only the first layer of what we are looking at, but the many other layers that are behind it. What we have been doing in these last years of the journey towards sustainability, because I want to underline it, sustainability is a never-ending journey. We will never reach sustainability. We will always do this travel towards sustainability. So what we have been doing in these first years, and now I am worried about the fact that is going to have a backlash. We have only presented the facade, no, of what are our really honest, good intentions of doing the right thing, but only the facade, and making a lot of storytelling about it. So it like, in a way, kind of giving the assumption to the people that we are doing everything already in the right way, instead of being honest to the point of also communicating the fact that that sustainability is our goal, but we haven't reached it, but we are working on it. And the first layer is beautiful. Yes, we want beauty, as I was saying before, but we have to work together, you know, in order to reach the depth of it. So when, you know, when, August, you are going on the pricing transparency, I think that you are very bold, because you are touching in people something that also is very important to create, rebuild, reconstruct our trust, which is that of giving the pricing transparency, which is already something very hygienic, you know, that is very important for us to understand what is really, you know, gone of what I'm paying into the production, you know, of what I'm buying, and what is instead just marketing, allow me to say, just marketing. But then, you know, there are other levels that in the research, as far as I know, are going deeper in the awareness of people today. People understand that transparency is one of the medium to make sure that our planet keeps on being the wonderful home for all of us. There is the understanding and the awareness that we are, in a way, kind of letting our planet going apart if we are not safe about what we are consuming. The people, of course. No? The transparency about people. These are things that people want to know. And actually, you know, in a way, I would also suggest that this never-ending journey is also opening new challenges, like animal welfare, which is the new entry, and that we have to be aware of the fact that also that kind of depth is the one that people out there are asking us to give them the trust that there is no unnecessary harm for the planet, but also no harm for people and animals. So this is very simple for us as people, if we are now in this beautiful salon talking about that. But for the industry, small or big, is the biggest headache that one could discuss in any kind of meeting, business meeting with the industry, because that implies the management of such a complex supply chain that we as people, we don't even imagine. The textile industry has the most complex supply chain of the industries. It is so difficult to get to the point of really get to the to the transparency of what people would instead ask ask the industry and the brands and the manufacturer to go for in any focus group. Like, I want to know, of course, what are the chemicals in my in the garment that I'm buying. This is a headache in terms of the chemicals that we are putting into the environment. Not at the end of what we put on our skin, but during the whole process, is something that we are still considering. How do we manage that? How do we get the transparency for ourselves as industry about such a little thing like, I want to know what are the chemicals. I want to make sure that every single farmer on the fields is treated in a fair way. This is the hugest headache of the industry. And not because they are mean, but because the complexity of the supply chain has got to such a level that is, something that it seems like the mission impossible to solve and to save and to clean up. So probably we need, and this is what we are thinking and fostering in our school, also to think to new business models, to new models of production that will respond to this need of a different way of consuming.
So with that in mind, I was just going to hand the microphone to you, Cecilia. I'm glad you took it. What's your take on what Simonetta is saying? Do you, if we're talking about new business models, is that something that TEKO can actively help or encourage or work with Swedish companies to achieve? And what would they even look like?
Well, I mean, this is, of course, something that we're looking at. We have had a huge production of textiles in the 70s and 80s in Sweden, which isn't there anymore. And of course, we would like to create new jobs in a sustainable way, and also to support the sustainability transformation, I would say. And that comes from not producing too much far, far away, to maybe producing a little less far away and reproducing locally. That's part of the future, I would say. But we also have a kind of a discussion going on with concern to the consumer behavior, when we say, okay, do the consumers need to know everything, or should we as an industry only produce really, really good things? And then the consumer could be sort of safe.
But how do you, like when you say really, really good things, who's the judge of that?
Yeah, of course. Well, I would say that I hope it's a pride of the industry to only put really good things on the market. It's not that case today, I would say. But I hope that in 5, 10, 15 years from now, that we will have a pride as an industry again.
But something that, how to put this, something that I've been thinking a lot about when it comes to how to marry the ideal of sustainability and the ideal of trust and transparency that we're talking about with the real flawed actual industry that fashion is, made up of real flawed human beings. It's like how, because on the one hand, I mean, fashion is an area where we like to be bad, I think, sometimes. It's like it's an area where, you know, if you I don't know, think of every single thing you put into your body. If you try to exercise and sleep your 8 hours and do all the, you know, good healthy things that we should do, gosh, how nice it is to just go into a shop and like buy a jumper right off the rack and not have to look at the label and think about the worker that produced it in some faraway land and, you know, all the gasoline that was spent, you know, getting that jumper into your hands and so on. Sometimes I wonder if maybe fashion is an area that maybe there's a resistance to some sustainability initiatives, just because it's an area that that it can just feel freeing to just to not have to be good. You know, that we need something in our lives where we can allow ourselves not to be responsible. And for some reason, fashion, I think, and you know, I'd be curious to hear if you agree or if you disagree, but fashion has become an area like that, maybe an area that is quite delicious to hate or to point fingers at, or I mean, what would even a fully sanitized fashion system look like? Would it still have experimentation? Because that's such an important part of fashion. Would it still be able to challenge and provoke? You know, I don't know. This was a... Who wants to take the baton? Go on.
No, it reminds me of... as I was beginning my PhD, I had this sort of frustration. I was assisting a curator, a design theorist, and I was fascinated by how in the middle of the 19th century, these thinkers, John Ruskin, William Morris, all these people were realizing the harm that the industrialization was causing both to humans and to the beauty of objects that were created. And I thought this was such a fascinating moment to explore. And I started thinking, geez, I hope there's someone in fashion who was also looking at, in this 1850s, maybe thinking the same way. So yeah, there is, but there isn't. In a way to explain the whole, the foundation of design as a discipline, who is sort of reflecting on the ethical issues that were raised when you produce something industrially. This has indeed merged into or developed into all these avant-garde movements in Europe. I won't start a lesson on the Deutsche Werkbund or the all these other, or Henri van de Velde or so on, but so this was one path. But then what was fascinating was how fashion would just keep going and never ever sort of reflect on, why do we keep producing these beautiful dresses? Why is this season pink and the next season yellow with frills and so on? And what I found fascinating is that from the beginning of this moment, when designers understand that they have a responsibility towards the worker, towards themselves, all these sort of fascinating texts that you read that are the basis of design thinking, at the same time fashion is just going straight for, you know, more production, more consumption. Let's open department stores, let's produce more, let's consume more. Because it feels that the primal urge that fashion is responding to is this idea of newness, of exactly what you're saying, being naughty in a way, and wanting, indulging in more. So up to this day, I haven't really found a great forgotten figure who managed to bridge the gap between both. In fact, if you look at all these alternatives that avant-garde movements have tried to come up with, first of all, they never lasted very long. The experiments of Van de Velde or all the other thinkers of garments at the time, it lasted a few years. It was often just to dress themselves and a few of their friends. It never really had a long-lasting impact. So yeah, I always find this quite fascinating, that it seemed that fashion never, because it's in this sort of cyclical speed, it's never really reflecting on, why are we even doing what we're doing? Well, that's it. I don't know. It's something that's often puzzled me. And
yeah, because also there's, I mean, I've been thinking, and I'll cycle back to you, August, in a way, because like when a company communicates a kind of intent of sustainability, it seems to go hand in hand often with a particular aesthetic. You know, you use terms like classic or timeless. I mean, timeless, I do remember reading on your website. So like it's almost as if it's like implied that fashion as trend driven is then bad, and then this classic timeless, you know, whatever that means, by contrast, is good. I mean, please tell us a bit about how you and your partner, you know, how you arrived at the aesthetic that ASKET is, and why you think it's important to use terms like timeless, and maybe together we can have a think about whether it always has to be like that, you know, or if you can in fact marry this desire for novelty with some of the sustainable practices and the trust and transparency that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is really, really interesting, and this is one of the key topics and one of the key issues, I think, in fashion that You said that fashion responds to an urge for newness. I would say that fashion has created the urge for newness and is highly active in constantly creating that urge among the consumer. And because fashion is very analog, unlike consumer electronics, where you have Moore's law and technology gets cheaper, faster, and there's innovation in a different degree. What can the fashion industry do? Well, they need to create an insecurity in the consumer to get something new, to soothe that ease. But it's the same thing all in all. Again, it's the trends come and go, but we just continue to consume. And as I said before, with speed and cost being the main KPIs or the dominant KPI, key performance indicators, or the main focus areas, if you will, for the past 20 years. We have then started to create these things that have a best before date with the worse and worse quality and with more and more neglect towards its origin. So I think that is the issue. I think there is fashion that is that is seasonal or collection based, that can be good if you produce it in a high quality, if you educate the consumer that if you want something good, you're going to have to pay for the handcraft, then I think it is possible to indulge in that kind of urge in a reasonably sustainable and conscious way, but not the way it is today, where the bulk of the volume out there is simply nowhere near a quality that can last more than 6 months or 12 months out there. So back to ASKET then, I mean, when we design, since we have set as a criterion that we're building a permanent collection, every garment that we have has to have the potential to be there forever. We have no sales, we have no seasonal collections, we have knitwear in fall and less knitwear in spring, yes, but everything we create has to be there forever. So we look backwards instead and try to identify the classics, the items that have been there forever, or at least have a recurring pattern that always come back.
But I mean, what if you really don't feel that you're represented by a grey crew neck merino jumper? What do you do? Totally fair. Someone once commented on our Instagram account when we asked people what they like about us. He said the sort of dystopic communist uniform look of everything. So it's quite fashionable at the moment. Exactly. No, and I mean, I think that's fair. And not everyone wants to look like, a Philippa K model, super typical Scandinavian minimal design. But at the end of the day, we've made it our mission to really perfect the garments that we use the most, that are really the volume drivers and some of the worst, pieces out there, causing the most damage, harm environmentally. T-shirts, underwear, the things that you really use often and unfortunately buy all too often because you keep on turning to cheap alternatives. And we want to, eliminate the bad supply of these items that we wear and use the most. And then hopefully, I think, but so far we haven't tackled that, and I don't think we will tackle that, there will be opportunities to find sustainable ways of producing and consuming more fashionable items that can't be in stock all the time. Yeah. With alternative materials so we really focus on what we see is the 80% of the items that you really use, and that is more predominant in menswear, of course, than women's wear. I think that is a slightly different ballgame. So, okay, you, August, you're talking from the vantage point of, I can't even remember the acronym, small, medium, whatever, something companies.
DNVB, yeah. Digital Native Vertical Brand.
Oh gosh, that's even another. But Holly, I wanted to ask you, have you noticed how, if there's any difference in how, so we have the small independent brands for whom it's, I don't want to say easier, but maybe, there's one way of trying to engage with the Higg index, for instance. What's the difference between, say, how a luxury fashion house, a multinational high street brand, and a insert acronym brand of the type that August has, how each one of these three different ways of manufacturing and producing clothing would interact with HIG, and the challenges, I guess, for each.
Okay, I'll get to that, but I first wanted to react to one of the things that you said before about that you sometimes feel that maybe, I don't know if you personally, or you feel that in fashion, people just want to go into a shop and be naughty and buy something. I think that will always exist, but I think that people do have the right that every single thing that we spend money on, that we know what we're actually contributing to. And I think that's what we're talking about when we say transparency. And I also think it's important when we're talking about it so often, as Simonetta, you said, it's super hip word. I mean, I love my job title now. People are like, oh, transparency manager, cool. But what are we actually talking about? What does transparency mean? Does it mean disclosing the suppliers in your supply chain? Does it mean being transparent about your organization and your governance and your policies internally? Does it mean sharing a product's life cycle? What are all the elements that make that up? And so what I can say, so how we describe transparency in relation to the HIG index, and so this is this huge data collecting tool, is that we say that we want to provide easy access throughout the value chain and of products to information that is clear, that it's comparable, so comparable amongst brands as well, amongst products, that it's trustworthy, so that it's verified. And
by whom? Verified by whom?
By verifiers. So we have third-party verifiers that are tied to the brands and an overview of who those organizations are. And so what did I say? Clear, complete, I missed that one. I think that's very important as well. And that means that you share a full story and not just parts of it. And that also ties into what you were saying about the Louis Vuitton campaign, having this beautiful image of these artisans. Is that the full story, or is that this cherry pick of some beautiful story that you want to tell? I think that's really important, to actually have these criteria for communicating when you start sharing information. And so how different organizations interact with the HIG index. Well, so we have these different tools. We have a tool for brands and retailers, and then everything's based around the full life cycle of a product. So brands and retailers assess from starting in their head offices how they design garments. I mean, a lot of decisions are made in the design process, and then it goes through everything that happens at the head office, through the product life cycle, so through the manufacturing, and then into the retail stores. And then we assess both the social elements, so for example, topics such as gender equality and fair pay within the headquarters, but also of the suppliers, and of course the environmental topics as well. And then you can look into the strategies that an organization has, and then actual measuring their performance. So how much energy did they use in a certain retail outlet, for example.
So wait, sorry, just to interrupt there, to make sure I understood. If a company signs up to be a part, or to be able to use the HIG index and to be part of SAC, does that mean that they have to open up completely to you? So, could there be areas where they would say, okay, this, and this, please examine it, but this, and this, and no, is a no-go? Would you accept that?
Well, no, we work differently. So that is the way that a lot of audits and certifications have taken place in the past. So especially if we're looking at a brand working with their supply chain, they would ask their factories, you have to meet these certain standards. And then verifiers would come in and say, or auditors would come in and say, okay, this is correct, this isn't correct. And then you'd have all these different brands asking a manufacturer to do things different ways. So you have this auditing fatigue. So the HIG index tool is self-assessment. We don't go in or assess anything. It's the brands, in relation to the brand tool, the brands and the retailers assess themselves. And for manufacturers as well, they assess themselves. And then we do verify what has been assessed through the verifying program. But it's not a pass or fail, or this is bad, or this is right. It's how can we together collaborate into improving your understanding of a sustainability element, and to improve that. Did that answer your question? Sorry.
Yes. But there's something else that I've been trying to mull over as we've been talking. And so when communication is such an important part of fashion today. I mean, communication and marketing. So if you're a brand for whom your sustainable practices, if sustainable practice is an important part of your business, you make sure to communicate this. But at the same time,
not always. Sorry.
No, wait. I'm. Hang on. Okay. So let's say if you want to put that out to the consumer that we are doing our very best in these areas connected to sustainability, you put that on your website. You put that across all your social media channels. You mention it in interviews and so on. But at the same time, I think we are a generation of consumers that have learned and are learning to be skeptical with the information that we're being given by a brand. So if somebody says, my brand is we break all our production costs down, and this is what a button costs, and this is what the fabric costs, and so on. For me, it just triggers this kind of, how do I know that you're telling me the truth? How do I know that you're being transparent with me? If you're, if you make a point of telling me all the time as the consumer how good you are, I think you must be hiding something. I don't know. There's something curious about. This is not a very. Since I'm trying to work this through as I'm talking, I don't have a fully formulated question for you. But there's something about this, the communication and transparency, self-communication or self-promotion and transparency that seems at odds. I don't know. Do you agree with
I understand where you're going, definitely. Because I think when it's in some circumstances, people may perceive it properly formulated, that a brand communicating themselves will only communicate this beautiful picture. And that's what I'm saying, that I think you really need to have clear criteria for communicating. That's why, I don't know, does anybody here, has any of you heard of the Higg Index before today? Oh, great. Okay, so there's a few. Okay, usually people are like, I don't know what you're talking about. But the reason why is that we've not yet allowed anybody to communicate anything about it, because we're saying we have to have this tool, we have to have it working, we have to have it verified, we have to test and learn and determine what are the criteria for communicating, so that brand A doesn't go out and say, I have a 80% Higg Index score. What does that mean? It's an index. It says this is where you are in your sustainability journey. So it's still a process. I lost my train of thought. So, brands communicating. But the funny thing is, so we're doing global consumer research, and last year we tested how to, with brands and with manufacturers and with consumers, and we had surveys and focus groups, which are really interesting. But in that case, we communicated from SAC. We said, we're the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, this is what we do, yada, 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 Higg Index. And really, nearly all of the consumers were like, what's this? This isn't the brand that I'm purchasing from. I don't understand this corporate lingo. We have to work on our communications anyway. But it was so far away from their bed, they said, I wish brand A would have communicated to me about it. So from that research, we were really showing people want to know that the brands communicate to them in their story, in a tone of voice that's engaging. And then that the SAC could be behind that. That was fine. So like as this endorser or this third party, but they really wanted the brand to communicate with them.
So we have about 20 or so minutes left before we move to another space and start drinking wine and eating canapes. Or I hope at least there are some canapes, because I'm quite hungry. But I wondered, I mean, it didn't really turn into the fluid audience discussion that I initially proposed. It's a bit difficult with microphones. But I think I'd really like, I've seen that some of you have taken some notes. Maybe you have questions. Maybe you have challenges. There are things that you'd like one of the panelists to expound on, or maybe throw us a totally left field. Please.
No, I think I can talk like this. Or first off, I think it's a wonderful discussion, and it's been very interesting to hear all your thoughts. I would like to reconnect to Simonetta, and when you talked about transparency, it was very poetic, and I loved how you defined transparency. But my question to you is, can sustainability, when you're talking about consumption, can you only say sustainability or sustainable? Don't you need to have another word in front of it, or how to say it? I mean, it's about trust and building trust to a consumer, and I think it would be more valid in our communication to add on more sustainable or something like that. Do you understand how I think? I mean, it will never be sustainable when we are talking about consumption goods. So we are failing in the beginning in the communication. Do you agree, Simonetta?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting this question, because you're opening open window and doors. Yes, so sustainability is a very difficult word and notion. And it's, first of all, because sustainability means sustaining something, to keeping something like the roof of our home, which is something that actually doesn't represent, even metaphorically, the situation in which we are today. The roof has already fallen down. We have to reconstruct our home. We have to restore our home. We have to rebuild our home. It's not 30 years ago. In the 70s, we could have thought that we could have still kept the roof of our home, as it was. Now we have to rebuild it. You have to restore it. We have to be regenerative. We cannot just sleep into the purpose of, let's be less harmful. It's like a thief that goes on a trial and says to the judge, this year I had been stealing less than last year. No, he goes in jail, so. So, I mean, I am really, I feel that sustainability is a very problematic word. For me, I have, in Italian we say, talk as you eat, so simple, in a simple way. For me, it's simple. It's about something that, of course, it must be beautiful, what we want to do, especially if we are talking about fashion, must be beauty, represent a culture of consuming beauty, not cosmetics. Of course, it has to be clean, and of course, it has to be just, beautiful, clean and just. Why don't we name things by their own attributes? And sustainability is, I'm using it too, because of course, at the end, you want to take shortcuts in the family that is, going into this journey, and with an intent that I understand as being honest. But you are totally right. In terms of communication, if we want really to now open the discussion and the conversation with the many people, we have to use normal, simple, clear words. And this is the beginning of transparency. Be clear, be simple, be honest, and talk as a human. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more, definitely. And I think in response to your specific question, what other word do we use in front of consumption? Something that, we try to rephrase consumption into, investment, specifically when it comes to garments, to help people understand that you need to pay a little bit more, even as a direct-to-consumer brand, without the markups of wholesale. You still need to invest a little bit more, and the key word being invest, because garments have to be seen as investments again, and not as consumables, not as perishable goods, basically. But if we want to use consumption, we try to use the word meaningful consumption, because we believe that, in our mission specifically is to restore meaningfulness in garments, because when you save for something, when you actually take the time to, you know, save for a garment that costs a little bit more, you buy it, you research it more, you have the interest, you go in depth about where it comes from, the features of it, you know, and in the end, when you buy it, it has a meaning to you, and it is something that can be passed on, hopefully even to, you know, a friend or even a family. And so, yeah, I think that meaningfulness is something that basically excludes everything that is, or not everything, but meaningfulness. If we try to be meaningful in our consumption, we will, per default, exclude certain very unsustainable practices.
Okay, I'll try to say something meaningful about the transparency and sustainability, because it's so deep in my heart, this question. And if I see like fashion, which is something that I love, as a planet by itself, and the planet Earth as a planet by itself, and we as human beings are trying to make the connection between the two so that the planet Earth doesn't become the smaller one. And tip over, I think there is something very important in this, which is that what is at the beginning of fashion is very much insecurity of who we are. Like, do we really love ourselves? Then why do we need to overproduce as much as we do? And that's for me a main question. And I think transparency is very important to understand where it comes from and where it's going, you know, to understand the whole cycle. But to understand this question of how much do we love ourselves, so that we make the choice of making our planet Earth more important than our planet fashion. So, thank you.
What is your point of view about greenwashing? Like, do you have some data about the consumer who knows this brand is doing greenwashing and this brand is not doing greenwashing, and what is?
Can you just explain a little more what you mean by greenwashing, just so that everybody understands. And then maybe Holly, would you like to tackle it?
Okay, for me, greenwashing is when a brand, a multinational brand, is doing some sustainable communication and sustainable marketing about some product, and they are saying that they are using this cotton and not this one, and voilà. And maybe it's not good for your kind of brand, and
maybe I can start. I don't have data or facts for you in relating to how consumers perceive that, but I can just speak personally, and I find it very difficult and very complex to navigate the current market and to learn what is or isn't sustainable, and even what sustainability means in relation to a product in the first place. So I find a lot of labeling very misleading into if something is an eco product or a green product or a conscious product or a fair product, or what does any of that mean? And I think this kind of communication has to be standardized, and I mean, that is something that we are working towards, so that there's just one standard way to communicate about specifically the HIG. But I do think a lot of communications out there are very misleading. And I know doing research for the communications work that we're doing, if you look at, for example, the Federal Trade Association in the US, read their green guides, they're a lot stricter than they are here. I don't know if we have any comparable initiatives here in Europe as well. But yeah, that was my personal reaction.
Don't know if I had something right now.
I can add on it, and also what the lady was saying. So yes, we have evidence of the fact that consumers are into fatigue, consumeristic fatigue. The consumeristic fatigue is concerning what you were saying, August, but in a way I think also is implied in what you were saying by being naughty, that has shifted from this I would say, fundamental human need of having the possibility to access things that belong to the ethical dimension of aesthetics, of beauty. That was, you know, the pristine role of fashion, you know, to give access to beauty. So this planet that you were meaning. And what has become instead I call it at this point, just to make the distinction, the apparel industry addiction to consumerism. That is instead troublesome for the many reasons that we were discussing today. And this has really, you know, there are studies that testify the fact that people are talking, especially young people of your generation, of this consumeristic fatigue. Labels also do bring water to this very problematic issue. Too many labels, as Holly were saying, labels that, as I was saying before, at the end of the day, they don't give to anybody, to NGOs or responsible, aware consumers, the possibility to know what is behind the label. They are like doors that get shut in front of your face, and you have to trust. And again, mishaps that happened inside also that world, you know, the so-called certification world, also contributing in shrinking the trust also towards certifiers, so that we are starting to listen to people saying, well, who is certifying the certifiers? Huh? So we are in a vicious circle at this point, you know, from wherever, you know, you look at the picture, it is complex, it is complicated, it is problematic. And so again, you know, I think that whatever brings this two dimension of what is really the need, the basic human need of, I would even say transgress, like you were saying, Anya, because it's true that we need transgression, and fashion has always been also a vehicle for express transgression. Transgression is enjoyable, let me say it, because you know, the Catholics probably they know better about it than Lutheran or Calvinist. Transgression can exist only if it's not incentivated to happen on a daily basis. What is the paradox in which we are now is that we are pushed to transgress on a daily basis instead of, in a way, keep the transgression, the luxury, this luxation, no? Because luxury stems from the word luxation. So doing something that is bringing out of order things once every while, in a ritualized way that gives a sense to the sacrifice in that moment, that we are not a sacred action of transgression. So it is this the point. It's not saying, okay, and now we all become, we punish and we all kind of become Calvinistic, penitent consumers. No. We don't want that. But you're right, the big impact, the big, huge and scary impact of our industry is on the apparel side. So in what we use on a daily basis, in which we now know that is where there is the real problem. This is why we love, you know, initiatives like the one of SAC, Sustainable Apparel Coalition, because they are addressing the big body of the elephant. That's where the real impact and fearful impact on our planet, the planet is all about. Our socks, our underwear, you know, our T-shirt, our kinos. I mean, these are the things that worldwide are creating the threatful impact on our planet and on the community of our world. the transgression. And here I would really claim for fashion to recuperate its role of instead being the driver of cultural changes. This is what has been, in a way kind of diluting and disappearing in the last decades. Fashion has a cultural role. And this is probably something that then the apparel industry can look at, but not become, as it is today, fashion that goes out of fashion.
That is impossible. Fashion will always go out of fashion.
Fashion races stay. As probably Emilie today already told us, we are talking about something that actually...
Do we have any more questions? Please.
So I heard that some luxury brands have restricted their consumption of bags, for instance, to 2 bags per year. There was somebody who contacted me actually about this, who wanted me to start buying Hermes bags to overcome this sort of problem for those who want to buy more than 2 bags per year. So I was wondering, so the first, since like these companies are bad companies, I thought that this had to do with exclusivity, that they wanted to be as exclusive as possible, but since they can set their own prices, now I'm wondering, is that maybe some kind of CSR measure? Have you heard something about this? And it's not only Hermes, I think it's also Louis Vuitton and other luxury brands.
I mean, in my understanding, that has to do with limiting the resale market. So I think that's specifically for customers that come from big markets like China, for instance. So I don't, you know, it's a weird practice. I don't think that, and it's kind of a bit racist, as I've understood it. I mean, or at least you're racially profiled when you go buying, because I don't think this is something that you would encounter if you are a French customer going to Hermes, you know, wanting to buy. I mean, I've heard that Victoria Beckham has like 12 Hermes bags. So, no, but you know what I mean? So I think...
No, but per year.
I don't think that it's something that has to do with sustainable practices or trying to educate the customer to consume less. I think it's more an economic measure. I don't know if any of my panelists have a better understanding of this phenomena, but I think it's just good business sense, basically. I think there was another question.
Yeah, this is maybe not a question, but more raising or sharing some of my thoughts, because I mean, now we've been talking about trust and transparency, but I also think of how does that look? How is the expression of that trust? Because also I think it's interesting in the field of sustainable fashion that is often comes down to these basic designs, that they are sort of trustworthy for the long-term perspective. Like, I mean, and I think that's great, but I think there's so many other expressions that could still be sustainable. And it's sort of, speaking of this being naughty and buying fashion that is in trend, or, I mean, I think there has to be a bigger diversity how things can look and how we can still be expressive and still be sustainable or make better choices. And also what type of products companies put on the shelves. I mean, like looking at, I mean, I'm a fashion designer working with research within the upcycling or redesign perspective on this, and I think it's so troublesome that we are still into this. I mean, we see it in Scandinavia now, speaking also with interiors, that you go back to this like Danish classics, and then you're safe. And it's something, again, about feeling safe and not taking risks and still, I mean, it's something with the look of things, the trust, the safeness, and that you make an investment. There is something there which I think is quite interesting to think about, because
I agree. Also because
I think it's
sorry, now I'm interrupting you, and I did ask you to ask a question. That's bad manners. But there's something about. Let's see if I can put this in a good way. Because when you I think when you limit, or my fear is that when you talk about only classics or about investment or about fashion that doesn't go out of fashion, which is why I was jumping into it. I wonder if, like, aren't we at risk maybe of a certain kind of elitism almost, like as if you have to be educated enough to know what separates an investment piece from just a regular piece, and to even engage in an investment piece in the first place, you have to have a certain disposable income. I'm wondering if there isn't, on some level, like in a lot of conversations surrounding issues like the ones we've been discussing today, that we exclude or sort of dismiss as bad a certain form of consumption. It's specifically a fast consumption, cheap consumption that is also directed towards a certain segment of consumers in our society, right? Let's say if we make a comparison with food, who consumes fast food, who consumes organic food, who goes to the organic shop, Naturalia here in the Marais and buys their, fancy grains for 10 times more than what, your overworked, I'm talking stereotypes now, but mother with many children who can't cook or, even take the time to read up about, how you consume sustainably versus just regular consumption. I mean, maybe I know we are running out of time and this is a big thing to lob on everyone, but maybe it's something that we can take out with us.